Good day everyone. Today I'm going to compare the new Tamron 28-75mm f2.8 VXD G2 against the Tamron 28-200mm f2.8 to 5.6 RXD. For some, it might be an odd comparison, but both have their own strengths and weaknesses. Looking at these two lenses, the Tamron 28-75 G2 have two extra features, while the Tamron 28-200 have only a lock switch, which is common for super zoom lens. So people might say why I'm even comparing a fixed aperture zoom lens against a variable aperture super zoom lens. I know there's a lot of people who's trying to decide between these two lenses. So if you're going to stick with me, we're going to find out in this video. Both of these amazing Tamron lenses is surprisingly light. 550 versus 575 grams. Why not? This is a zoom test outdoor. As you can see, the Tamron 28-75 G2 doesn't change its aperture, hence doesn't affect the exposure. On the other hand, the Tamron 28-200 extends far and away, but the light varies a little bit due to the change in aperture. Here's the side-by-side so you can see the actual difference. Which one would you prefer? Short range or long range? Fixed or variable? Please comment your opinion below so we can have a discussion with other fellow photographers. This is another outdoor zoom test with the Tamron 28-75mm G2 and the Tamron 28-200mm RXD. This super zoom lens definitely has an edge here. But notice a change in aperture when zooming all the way to 200mm. By the way, I do have an independent review on each of these lenses, and the link will be somewhere above or in the video description below. And now for an indoor zoom test, notice the performance of the Tamron 28-75mm f2.8 G2. Given a fixed ISO, it's very consistent within all the focal range. And here's the Tamron 28-200mm f2.8 to 5.6 RXD. Given the same fixed ISO, notice the drastic change when zooming all the way up to its longest focal range. So when shooting on a fixed ISO for a cleaner image, the Tamron 28-75mm G2 is definitely the winner here. You might need to use an additional light source or maybe a flash when dealing with the Tamron 28-200mm indoors. Speaking of flash, I personally use the Sony f45RM because it's compact but powerful. I have a thorough review of this on my channel if you're keen to have a look. Now with the sharpness test, still indoors, but now I'm going to set it to auto ISO. I'm shooting 3D dimensional objects here, so I'll mostly focus on the center sharpness. This is from Tamron 28-75 G2 at 28mm with auto ISO 400. It's the same story with the Tamron 28-200 at 28mm. It technically starts at f2.8 from 28 to 30mm, hence I've got the same auto ISO 400. Here's the side-by-side angle. My Lightroom doesn't have the profile correction yet for the Tamron 28-75 G2, that's why you might notice some minor vignetting and distortion. But overall, they almost look the same. I actually didn't notice any difference on both at 28mm. Very sharp, good contrast and autofocus background. Now we're going to find out what will happen if we zoom in a little bit further. Now this is at 75mm from Tamron 28-75 G2. The light changed a little bit, that's why the ISO increased to 500. Still very sharp and the bokeh here is much better. I haven't fully matched it with the Tamron 20-200 RXD. I ended up with at least 73mm. Notice that the aperture changed to f4, hence the auto ISO value increased to 1000. So again with the side-by-side, at 75mm on Tamron 20-75 G2, auto ISO is 500 at f2.8. And 73mm on Tamron 20-200, auto ISO is 1000 at f4. The latter has more aerial focus but with noticeable noise due to high ISO. That's the downside of using variable aperture when shooting indoors. For most scenes, majority will prefer a fixed aperture. Can you see it? That's the noise right there. To overcome this limitation, I highly recommend using a flash when shooting indoors. So zooming all the way to 200mm, the subject of course looks a bit magnified. The aperture has changed to f5.6, and to compensate, auto ISO has increased to 2000. For me, it's still a very usable image, although the noise is more pronounced here. Side by side at 75mm f2.8 with the G2 and at 200mm f5.6 with the RXD. Which one would you prefer? Take note that this was shot indoor, and as expected, lower ISO will always yield a cleaner image. But at the same time, it only goes to 75mm, while on the other hand, it can reach up to 200mm in spite of noise. Make sure that you're watching this on a desktop or at least on Full HD or 4K to observe the difference. And I'll also put a download link for you guys to check it by yourself. Here's another shot indoor with a fixed ISO of 100. You won't really notice any difference at 28mm, they both look the same. Zooming it again at 100%, the area of focus might slightly be different. It's centered on the G2 while it's a bit off-centered with the RXT, but both lenses renders really sharp images. Now jumping to the 70mm focal length, G2 is still at f2.8 while the RXD at f4, which looks like slightly bit darker than the left. Same result, very sharp images, although the area of focus is slightly bit different. The shot from the 28 to 200mm looks more detailed and has more contrast, probably because the aperture was stopped down to f4. The only source of light here is coming from my two large windows, and depending on how bright or dark your place is, variable aperture lens will really struggle to gather that sufficient amount of light it needed to expose the shot correctly. Now checking its autofocus performance, the Tamron 28-75mm VXD G2 is really fast. It grabs the subject quietly and instantly locks the focus. I don't know what's happening with the 28-200 RXD. It's probably struggling to lock focus on that non-contrasty shining white color. I tried it again with a different subject and it decently grabs focus. Of course, different scene and subject may vary its AF capability. And now for Bokeh, which is the last part of this video. Here's a 28-75mm at f2.8 and at 28-75mm at f4. The smaller the f-stop value or the larger the aperture opening, the more background blur you can get. Continuing from 75mm f4 to 200mm f5.6, I just need to recompose the shot as I am too close. So here's a 28mm starting at f2.8 all the way to 200mm at f5.6. So that's it guys. Regarding the price, there's $170 between these two. Your choice of course will depend on what type of photography that you do. And as always, if you like this content, hit like or share or even subscribe to support this channel. You guys are awesome. Thank you.